The mountain wind carried her mother's last breath away 3 days ago. Now Sarah stood at the cabin door where lamplight flickered like a dying heartbeat, her small fist trembling against weathered wood. Behind that door lived the man who'd whispered those words at the funeral, words that made the church women gasp and the preacher's wife clutch her pearls. "Your mama's gone, but my bed ain't empty," he'd said, his eyes holding secrets darker than the Colorado peaks. The door creaked open, and she saw his silhouette against the fire's glow. Her stomach twisted with hunger, fear, and something else she couldn't name. Subscribe to discover what happens when desperation meets desire in the unforgiving wilderness. Sarah's bare feet found every sharp stone on the mountain path, but the pain felt distant compared to the hollow ache where her heart used to be. 3 days since they'd lowered Mama into the frozen ground. 3 days since the last of the church ladies had stopped bringing casseroles and started whispering about what's to become of that poor child. The wind cut through her thin dress like judgment itself, carrying the scent of pine and something else, wood smoke from the cabin that sat like a dark promise against the tree line. She'd walked this path before, always with Mama's warm hand in hers, always knowing they'd turn back before reaching the door where the mountain man lived alone. The cabin windows glowed amber in the gathering dusk, and she could see his shadow moving inside like a restless spirit. Jeremiah Colt, that's what the townspeople called him when they bothered to speak of him at all. Most times they just crossed themselves and hurried past when his name came up in conversation. Mama had always pulled her closer when they'd encountered him in town, but Sarah had caught the way her mother's eyes lingered on his broad shoulders, the way her voice got softer when she'd mention his name. "He's a good man underneath all that loneliness," Mama had whispered once, "but good men can be the most dangerous kind when they've been alone too long." Now Sarah stood at his door with nothing but the clothes on her back and the memory of his words burning in her ears. The church ladies had made their decision. She'd be sent to the orphanage in Denver come morning, packed away like an unwanted burden. But something in Jeremiah's voice at the funeral had sounded different from their hollow sympathy. When he'd leaned down and whispered those shocking words, his breath had been warm against her ear, and for the first time since Mama died, she'd felt something other than cold emptiness. The scandal of it had sent ripples through the congregation, but Sarah had heard something else beneath the impropriety, a promise that maybe, just maybe, she wouldn't have to face the world completely alone. Her small fist hovered inches from the rough-hewn door, trembling not just from the mountain cold, but from the weight of the choice before her. Behind this door lay either salvation or ruin, and at 15 she wasn't sure she knew the difference anymore. The wind picked up, howling through the pines like all the ghosts of winter, and she thought she heard Mama's voice carried on it, not warning her away, but urging her forward. "Sometimes the most dangerous choice is the only one that leads to living," Mama had told her once, and now those words felt like a benediction in the growing darkness. The door opened before she could knock, and there he stood. 6 feet of weathered muscle and careful eyes, his dark hair touched with silver at the temples. Jeremiah Colt looked like he'd been carved from the mountain itself, all sharp angles and hidden depths. His shirt hung open at the collar, revealing the strong column of his throat, and his sleeves were rolled up to show forearms marked with old scars and new calluses. When his gaze met hers, something shifted in the air between them, heavy and electric as a summer storm. "I wondered if you'd come," he said, his voice rough as granite, but gentle as falling snow. The lamplight behind him painted golden edges around his silhouette, and Sarah felt herself step forward without conscious thought, drawn by the warmth that radiated from both the fire and the man who tended it. "The church ladies say I'm going to Denver tomorrow," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the wind. "But I remembered what you said, and I thought maybe—" She couldn't finish the sentence, couldn't voice the desperate hope that had driven her up this mountain path in the dark. Jeremiah's eyes softened, and he stepped aside, his large hand gentle on her shoulder as he guided her into the warmth of his sanctuary. a gesture that felt like both rescue and surrender, sealing a fate that neither of them could yet fully comprehend. The cabin's warmth hit Sarah like a physical embrace, and she realized she'd been holding her breath for 3 days straight. Everything inside spoke of careful solitude: a single plate on the rough table, one chair by the fire, a bed in the corner that looked too large for just one man. Jeremiah moved around her with surprising grace for someone so large, his boots silent on the worn wooden floors as he ladled soup from a pot that hung over the fire. The smell of venison and wild herbs filled the air, rich and nourishing in a way that made her stomach clench with sudden, desperate hunger. She hadn't eaten since the funeral, hadn't been able to swallow past the knot of grief that had taken up residence in her throat. "Sit," he said, gesturing to the chair by the fire, and his voice carried an authority that made her obey without question. As she settled into the worn leather seat, she noticed how his eyes tracked her movements, cataloguing every detail. The way her dress hung loose on her too thin frame, the dark circles under her eyes, the way her hands shook as she reached for the bowl he offered. "Your skin and bones," he murmured, and there was something almost tender in his disapproval. "When's the last time you ate something that mattered?" The question hung between them, loaded with implications that went far beyond food, and Sarah found herself unable to meet his gaze. The soup was rich and warming, and as she ate, Jeremiah settled into a chair across from her, his long legs stretched toward the fire. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of quiet that came from two people who understood that some wounds were too deep for words. She could feel him watching her, studying her with the same careful attention he might give to tracking a wounded animal through the forest. "Your mama was a good woman," he said finally, his voice soft as smoke. "She deserved better than what this world gave her." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow, and she had to set down her spoon as tears threatened to spill over. "She used to talk about you," Sarah whispered, the admission slipping out before she could stop it. "She said you were the kind of man who understood what it meant to lose everything." Jeremiah's jaw tightened, and something dark flickered across his features, a shadow of old pain that made Sarah's chest ache in recognition. "She was right about that," he said, his voice rough with memory. "Lost my wife and boy to fever 5 years back. This cabin's been nothing but echoes ever since." The confession hung in the air between them, raw and honest, and Sarah felt something shift in her understanding of the man who'd offered her shelter. As the fire crackled and the wind howled outside, Sarah found herself studying the details of Jeremiah's solitary life, the way he'd arranged everything within easy reach of one person, the careful economy of movement that spoke of years spent alone. But there were other details too, things that suggested he hadn't always been solitary: a second cup hanging on a peg by the stove, a quilt folded at the foot of the bed that looked too delicate for his large hands to have made. "You kept her things," Sarah observed, and Jeremiah's eyes followed her gaze to the quilt. "Some ghosts are worth keeping," he said simply, but when his eyes met hers again, there was something new in them, a recognition that maybe, just maybe, the living deserved as much attention as the dead. The evening stretched between them like a held breath, full of unspoken possibilities and dangerous promises. When Jeremiah finally stood to bank the fire for the night, his movements were careful and deliberate, as if he were trying not to startle a wild creature that had wandered into his sanctuary. "You can take the bed," he said, his back to her as he worked. "I'll make do with the floor." But Sarah shook her head, something fierce and determined rising in her chest. "Your mama's gone, but your bed ain't empty," she repeated his words from the funeral, her voice steady despite the way her heart hammered against her ribs. "You said that for a reason." When he turned to face her, the look in his eyes was equal parts hunger and restraint, and Sarah knew that whatever happened next would change both of their lives forever. The storm outside had grown fiercer, rattling the cabin's wooden frame like an angry spirit demanding entry. Sarah sat on the edge of the narrow bed, her fingers tracing the rough wool of the blanket that still held the scent of pine and something distinctly masculine. Marcus stood by the window, his broad shoulders silhouetted against the lightning that split the sky, and she could feel the tension radiating from him like heat from the dying fire. The space between them felt charged with electricity more dangerous than the storm itself. "Your mama?" he said finally, his voice barely audible above the wind. "She ever tell you about the choices a woman has to make when the world turns cold?" Sarah's breath caught in her throat because she knew he wasn't really asking about her mother at all. He was asking about her, about this moment, about the way her body had begun to respond to his presence despite every rational thought screaming warnings in her mind. The cabin felt smaller now, intimate in a way that made her skin flush with something that wasn't entirely fear. Marcus turned from the window, and the look in his eyes was raw, with a hunger that made Sarah's pulse quicken. "I've been alone on this mountain for 7 years, he said, each word deliberate and heavy with meaning. 7 years of talking to ghosts and shadows, of waking up to nothing but silence and the sound of my own breathing." He took a step closer, and Sarah could see the way his hands trembled slightly, as if he were fighting against some invisible force that pulled him toward her. The fire crackled and hissed, casting dancing shadows on the walls that seemed to mock the careful distance they were trying to maintain. Sarah felt something shift inside her chest, a recognition that was both terrifying and inevitable. She had lost her mother, her home, her entire world, and now she sat in this stranger's cabin, feeling more alive than she had in months. The realization hit her like a physical blow. She wanted this, wanted him, wanted to fill the aching void inside her with something warm and real and dangerous. "I ain't asking you for nothing you don't want to give," Marcus said, his voice rough with restraint. "But I'm telling you true. If you stay in that bed tonight, if you let me lie down beside you, there ain't no going back to the way things were." The honesty in his words cut through her like a blade, sharp and clean and impossible to ignore. Sarah knew he was offering her a choice, but it felt more like a confession, a laying bare of souls that left them both vulnerable and exposed. The wind howled outside, and Sarah realized that the storm wasn't just in the sky. It was in this room, in the space between their bodies, in the way her heart hammered against her ribs like a caged bird, desperate for freedom. She looked into Marcus's eyes and saw her own loneliness reflected back at her, magnified and transformed into something that might destroy them both or save them from the crushing weight of their solitude. Dawn came slowly to the mountain, creeping through the cabin windows like a guilty secret. Sarah woke to find herself pressed against Marcus's chest, his arm wrapped around her waist with a possessiveness that should have frightened her, but instead filled her with a warmth that had nothing to do with the dying embers in the fireplace. She could feel his heartbeat beneath her cheek, steady and strong, and the realization of what had passed between them in the darkness hit her with the force of an avalanche. The memory came back in fragments, the way he had whispered her name like a prayer, the gentle roughness of his hands as they traced the curve of her spine, the moment when grief had transformed into something else entirely. She had given herself to him not out of desperation, but out of a hunger she hadn't even known existed, a need to feel alive in the face of so much death and loss. Now, in the pale morning light, she wondered if she had crossed a line from which there could be no return. Marcus stirred beneath her, and she felt his body tense as consciousness returned. For a moment, neither of them moved, both afraid to break the spell that had carried them through the night. Then his hand found her hair, fingers threading through the tangled strands with a tenderness that made her throat tighten with emotion. "Sarah," he murmured, and her name on his lips sounded different now, weighted with intimacy and something that might have been regret. She lifted her head to look at him, and the expression in his eyes was complex, desire mixed with concern, satisfaction tempered by uncertainty. "Did I hurt you?" he asked, and the vulnerability in his voice made her chest ache. She shook her head, unable to find words for what had actually happened between them. It hadn't been hurt. It had been awakening, a violent and beautiful shattering of everything she thought she knew about herself. The cabin felt different in the daylight, smaller and more intimate, as if their joining had somehow changed the very air they breathed. Sarah could see the details she had missed in the darkness. The careful way Marcus had arranged his few possessions, the books stacked beside the bed, the photograph of a woman tucked into the mirror frame. The sight of that photograph sent a chill through her, a reminder that she wasn't the first woman to find refuge in this man's arms. Marcus followed her gaze, and his jaw tightened. "My wife," he said simply, and the word hung between them like a blade. "She died in childbirth 8 years ago, the baby too." The pain in his voice was old but still sharp, and Sarah understood suddenly why he had been so careful with her, why his touch had carried such reverence. She wasn't just a woman to him, she was a second chance, a possibility he had thought lost forever, and the weight of that responsibility settled on her shoulders like a mantle she wasn't sure she was strong enough to bear. 3 weeks had passed since the storm, and Sarah had settled into a rhythm of life on the mountain that felt both natural and impossible. She cooked Marcus's meals, mended his clothes, and shared his bed with an ease that would have scandalized the good people of the town below. But here, in this isolated world of pine and stone and endless sky, the rules seemed different, shaped by necessity and desire rather than convention and judgment. Marcus had proven to be a gentle teacher in all things, showing her how to read the weather in the clouds, how to preserve meat for the long winter ahead, how to find pleasure in her own body without shame or fear. He spoke little, but his actions were eloquent, and Sarah found herself learning a language of touch and glance that was more intimate than any words they might have shared. Yet beneath the surface contentment, she sensed a restlessness in him, a tension that grew stronger with each passing day. The answer came on a Tuesday morning when she found him standing at the window, staring down the mountain path with an expression of grim resignation. "They're coming," he said without turning around, and Sarah's blood turned to ice in her veins. She didn't need to ask who. She could see the dust cloud rising from the valley, could make out the shapes of men on horseback moving steadily upward. The outside world had finally found them, and with it came all the complications they had been hiding from. "The sheriff's among them," Marcus continued, his voice flat and emotionless, "and probably your uncle, if I'm reading the signs right." Sarah's stomach clenched with fear and something that might have been guilt. She had known this moment would come, had known that their sanctuary couldn't last forever, but she hadn't prepared herself for the crushing weight of reality crashing down on their carefully constructed world. The thought of leaving this place, of leaving him, felt like dying all over again. Marcus turned to face her, and the look in his eyes was fierce with protectiveness and something darker. "They'll try to take you back," he said, crossing to where she stood frozen by the stove. "They'll say I corrupted you, that I took advantage of your grief." His hands found her shoulders, gripping tight enough to leave marks. "But you and I know the truth, don't we, Sarah? You came to me willing, and you stayed because you wanted to stay." The sound of hoofbeats grew louder, and Sarah felt the walls of the cabin closing in around her. She thought of her uncle's cold house, of the life of servitude and silent suffering that awaited her in town, of all the ways the world would punish her for choosing love over propriety. Then she looked into Marcus's eyes and saw her own determination reflected back at her, magnified and transformed into something that might just be strong enough to weather whatever storm was coming up that mountain path toward them.